Hi everyone, and welcome to our module on the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier surrounds central nervous system blood vessels, and it tightly controls the content of the interstitial fluid in the central nervous system. There are two main factors that are the anatomic basis for this barrier. The first one are these things called tight junctions, which are between endothelial cells of the capillaries, and they only allow certain molecules to get through. And then the second major part are the astrocytes. They have foot processes that overlap on the capillary walls, and together these two things function to create the blood-brain barrier. So water, some gases, and especially lipid-soluble small molecules easily diffuse across. But importantly, bacteria and many drugs cannot get into the central nervous system because of the blood-brain barrier. And it's high yield to know that glucose and amino acids can't cross directly, but they have special carrier-mediated transport proteins in the cell walls that let things get across the blood-brain barrier. Circumventricular organs, or the CVOs, are vascular brain structures that are around the ventricles. That's why they're called circumventricular. And they have no blood-brain barrier. And this is the way that the CNS communicates directly with the bloodstream without having to worry about the blood-brain barrier. Some of these sense things and some of these secrete things from the brain, and there are four key CVOs that you should know about. The first one is the area postrema. There's one called the OVLT, the subfornical organ, and the median eminence of the hypothalamus, and we'll talk about all of those now. So the area postrema is something you should think about anytime you hear about a patient having nausea and vomiting in response to chemotherapy. It's at the bottom end or the caudal end of the fourth ventricle in the medulla, and it's sometimes called the chemoreceptor trigger zone. It's outside the blood-brain barrier, so chemo agents can affect this area, and it sends signals to the vomiting center in the medulla, and that's why patients have vomiting after certain chemotherapy agents. The OVLT stands for the organum vasculosum of the lamina terminalis, and that's a mouthful, so most people just call it the OVLT. It's on the anterior wall of the third ventricle. Remember, all these structures are near a ventricle. That's why they're called circumventricular. And it contains osmosensory neurons, so this is the way the brain senses the osmolarity of the blood and responds to that. The subfornical organ, or the SFO, is another of the circumventricular organs. It's found on the anterior wall of the third ventricle, and it responds to many circulating substances, although its exact biological role is not entirely clear. One of the substances it's been shown to respond to is angiotensin II. There are angiotensin receptors found in the subfornical organ, and it's hypothesized that it may play a role in the body's response to changes in angiotensin II levels, and it projects to many other areas of the brain. The median eminence of the hypothalamus is outside the blood-brain barrier, and this releases hormones into the vascular system that goes to the pituitary gland. So this is the way the hypothalamus can regulate the pituitary gland. It doesn't want to have the blood-brain barrier blocking its ability to send hormones to the pituitary gland. And finally, I'll just mention a few other areas that don't have a blood-brain barrier. The posterior pituitary gland secretes oxytocin and ADH, and it does this without being interfered with by the blood-brain barrier, and the pineal gland releases melatonin directly into the bloodstream as well. The last thing I'll mention is vasogenic or cerebral edema, and this is an image of someone's brain, and the white matter here shows that there is cerebral edema. And when this happens, you have breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, and you're sometimes asked about that on your boards. You should be aware that in order for all that blood and fluid to spill into the brain, you need to lose the blood-brain barrier, and it happens after trauma and stroke. And this can cause swelling of brain tissue and herniation, and we discuss these things in other modules. And so that concludes our module on the blood-brain barrier.